In 1337, one arrogant decision dragged Europe into over a century of bloodshed, betrayal, famine, and death. A war so massive that entire generations were born, lived, and died inside it. And the craziest part, at the beginning, England had almost no chance of winning. France was richer, larger, more populated, and considered the most powerful kingdom in the Christian world. Paris was one of Europe's greatest cities, while England was seen as little more than a rainy island on the edge of Europe. But England had something France underestimated: a king willing to completely rewrite the rules of war. And by the time the conflict was over, knights would be slaughtered by peasants, kings would be captured alive, entire cities would starve to death, and a plague would wipe out nearly half of Europe. This was the beginning of the 100 Years' War. For centuries, England and France fought over land in mainland Europe. But by 1337, the English crown controlled only one major territory in France, Aquitaine, and the King of France, Philip I, wanted it back. To him, England was weak. France had more soldiers, more wealth, more cities, and more influence. Victory seemed inevitable, so Philip officially seized English lands in France. For England's king, Edward II, this wasn't just an insult. It was economic warfare. England's entire economy depended on two things: wine from Aquitaine and wool exports to Flanders, in modern-day Belgium. And English wool was legendary across Europe. Softer, stronger, and perfect for luxury textiles. Entire industries depended on it. But once France pressured Flanders to stop trading with England, Edward realized something terrifying. If he did nothing, England could collapse financially. War became unavoidable. But Edward didn't plan to fight defensively. Instead, he came up with a strategy that shocked Europe. If France wanted war, England would bring hell directly into France itself. The English launched devastating mounted raids known as chevauchés. These weren't normal military campaigns. They were organized destruction. Villages were burned, farms destroyed, civilians terrorized. Entire regions were left starving behind English armies. The goal wasn't just conquest. Edward wanted ordinary French people to lose faith in their king. And honestly, it worked. But there was one huge problem. War was expensive. Edward spent enormous amounts of money bribing foreign rulers for alliances, including the Holy Roman Emperor. Most happily accepted English gold, and then barely helped at all. By 1340, England was drowning in debt. Meanwhile, France controlled the English Channel with a massive navy. Some feared a French invasion of England itself. At that point, many believed the war was already lost. Then Edward did something completely insane. Ignoring the advice of nearly all his commanders, he attacked a much larger French fleet near the Port of Sluys, and against all odds, he won. The battle destroyed much of France's naval power and gave England control of the Channel again. Suddenly, the impossible no longer seemed impossible. But Edward still needed a way to beat France on land. And this is where everything changed. For centuries, medieval warfare revolved around armored knights charging on horseback. European nobles believed cavalry was unstoppable. Edward disagreed. Instead of relying entirely on knights, he built armies around something far cheaper and far deadlier: longbowmen. English longbows were terrifying weapons. A skilled archer could fire arrows faster than crossbows, at longer range, with enough force to pierce armor. But mastering the weapon took years of brutal practice. English boys trained from childhood, turning ordinary peasants into lethal soldiers. And soon, France would learn exactly how dangerous that was. In 1346, King Philip I gathered a massive army to finally crush the English once and for all. Near the village of Crécy, The French advanced confidently. They heavily outnumbered the English. Many French knights believed the battle would be over within hours. Instead, it became one of the greatest military disasters in medieval history. First came the Genoese crossbowmen hired by France. But before they even got close enough to fire effectively, thousands of English arrows rained down on them. The mercenaries panicked and retreated. Then the French knights charged directly through their own fleeing troops. Chaos exploded across the battlefield. Horses collapsed under volleys of arrows. Knights suffocated beneath piles of bodies. Mud, blood, and broken armor covered the field. And the English longbowmen kept firing. Again, and again, and again. One medieval chronicler claimed the arrows fell like snow. Even the blind King John of Bohemia joined the attack. Refusing to abandon the battle, he ordered his companions to tie their horses together and lead him into combat. All of them were later found dead. Still tied together. By the end of Crusade, Europe was in shock. The greatest knights in Christendom had been massacred by common peasants, and England still was undone. After the victory, Edward marched north and surrounded the heavily fortified city of Calais. The siege lasted almost a full year. Inside the city, starvation became unbearable. First people ate horses, then dogs, then rats. Some reports even hinted at cannibalism. Desperate civilians tried leaving the city, but Edward refused to let them pass through English lines. Thousands were trapped between both armies with no food and nowhere to go. Finally, Calais surrendered, but Edward turned the surrender into political theater. According to chroniclers, he demanded the city's leaders come out barefoot with ropes around their necks, prepared for execution. Then, at the last moment, his pregnant queen begged him for mercy. Edward reluctantly agreed. Whether staged or genuine, the moment transformed him from conqueror into legend. But while England celebrated victory, something far worse than war was approaching Europe. The Black Death. The disease arrived through trade routes from Asia, carried by fleas living on black rats aboard merchant ships. Once infected, victims developed fever, swollen lymph nodes, blackened skin, internal bleeding, and unbearable pain. Many died within days. The plague spread so fast that entire villages vanished before help could arrive. By the end, between 30 and 50% of Europe's population was dead. Some cities lost more than half their inhabitants. Mass graves filled Europe. And yet somehow, the war continued. In fact, the chaos of the plague made parts of the conflict even more brutal. With governments weakened and populations shattered, bands of soldiers roamed France almost like private corporations of violence, raiding towns for profit. Then the French King Philip V died. His son, Johnny, inherited the throne, and France desperately hoped the new king would restore order. But England had another terrifying commander rising to power. Edward II's son, the Black Prince. Unlike many medieval nobles, the Black Prince actively fought on the battlefield. And in 1355, he launched one of the most devastating raids of the entire war. Southern France burned. Cities were looted. Villages disappeared in smoke. The French population watched helplessly while their king struggled to respond. Johnny knew he needed a major victory. So in 1356, he gathered a massive army and cornered the English near Poitiers. The English were exhausted, hungry, and heavily outnumbered. If the French simply waited, the English probably would have surrendered. But pride destroyed that plan. The French attacked. At first, it looked like England might finally lose. French soldiers advanced aggressively, and brutal close combat erupted across the battlefield. But the English adapted faster. Their archers shattered formations while disciplined infantry isolated smaller groups of French soldiers and destroyed them one by one. Then came the moment nobody expected. The King of France himself became trapped in the fighting. Now here's the strange thing about medieval warfare. Ordinary soldiers were expendable. But nobles were valuable. Killing a knight meant losing potential ransom money. So while peasants slaughtered each other round them, aristocrats often tried capturing enemy nobles alive. And that's exactly what happened at Poitiers. By the end of the battle, the impossible had happened once again. The English captured the King of France alive, a reigning monarch, taken prisoner on the battlefield by an army that should never have been able to defeat France in the first place. It was one of the most humiliating moments in French history. And unbelievably, the 100 Years' War was still only beginning.